Hello YouTube, and welcome to a new episode of The Educated Barbarian. Today I want to discuss with you guys the concept of tolerance. As you might have noticed, in this day and age, it is extremely important to be tolerant to the point that it appears to have become a cardinal virtue. Other things like strength, like courage, like honesty, take a secondary role, and to be a good citizen of the world, you first and foremost must be tolerant. If you drive around where I live, for example, you'll see a bunch of yard signs, and they all say things like be kind or be tolerant. They never say be strong or be brave. That means something. It means that as a society, we have all accepted the notion that indeed tolerance was the most important virtue. And so the people who refuse to be that and who are intolerant are rejected and seen as bad people. In 2023, you could be dishonest, you could be greedy, you could be weak. All of these things are not positive per se, but they would never warrant the amount of pushback and the amount of hatred you would receive if you were simply intolerant, to the point that many have now experienced a form of social death for the simple crime of refusing to accept an idea or practice that they perceive as wrong or destructive. And while there is now more and more pushback against these practices, against these cancel cultures, it's interesting to note that those who oppose the notion of tolerance take up the role of the devil, meaning that even though they are detractors of it, they have come to believe that this fact makes them bad and that the people who promote tolerance are good. So across the board, tolerance has become good in the eyes of everyone. And this cannot stand. As a good Nietzschean, it is something that I absolutely have to stand against, not simply because this isn't true, but also because letting this ideological tyranny run unchallenged is, in my opinion, a one-way ticket to decadence. So today, using the work of our good friend Friedrich Nietzsche, I am going to prove to you not only that tolerance isn't a virtue, but that its undisputed reign on our society and civilizations is both a symptom and the reason for the decline of society and mankind. So, you might have guessed it, philosophy is back on the menu, and we're in for a very long video, so grab yourself a nice drink, and we're going to finally get into it. So we're going to start with a little lesson in morality. Because if we are to understand why tolerance became so prevalent, we have to observe the past, because it was not always the case. There used to be ages where tolerance was not a virtue at all, and people didn't strive to be tolerant. So what exactly happened for it to become so massive and major nowadays? Well, if we believe, our good friend Friedrich again, there was a form of evolution or devolution of mankind. And it's something that he describes in length in his book, The Genealogy of Morals, that you can read if you want. But it's also present in Beyond Good and Evil in the chapter, What is Noble? And in its chapter, Nietzsche aims to describe what people throughout the ages deemed noble. So, he describes the morality of each age in morality, because morality is the deciding force behind what is good and what is bad, what is noble and what is not. So at the start, according to him, there was the aristocratic age, which relied on the existence of gradations of ranks and differences of worth among human beings. At the start, some people were deemed good, some people were deemed bad. The aristocrats were excellent, they were the good, they ruled over society, and they were the ones deciding the value. They were the ones saying, this is a virtue and this is something that must be avoided. And in Nietzsche's opinion, this gave birth to excellence, as he states that every elevation of the type man has been the work of an aristocratic society. However, this came at a price. Namely things like slavery that Nietzsche describes as unavoidable consequences of a society that deems that some people are inferior than others. And as if you know your history, you'll know that many systems that relied on aristocracy had a minority of people who ruled over a majority of slaves, people who had minimal rights. And this is something that Nietzsche never attempts to deny. In his own words, the truth is hard. And in this hardened world, those who came to rule over the rest were the strong. So at the start, those who came into power did not come into power because they were smarter or because they were more politically equipped. They came into power because they could dominate others with their physical attributes. These people, Nietzsche names them the barbarians, men of prey, still in possession of unbroken strength of will and desire for power, who threw themselves upon weaker, more moral, more peaceful races. If I were to sum it up, these were uncivilized men. They were men who had not yet integrated the idea and notion that we're all equal and it's bad to hurt other people. They did not care. They turned the people around them, the people weaker than them, into slaves, into subservience. So essentially, if we look at history, what Nietzsche is describing here is the establishment of feudality in Europe, le système féodal. You have a king, you have someone who owns the land, and then he has his people, and his people work for him, they work the land for him. And of course, there is a give and take. He gives protection, but he also gets a lot back in return. And that system eventually shattered and gave way to what we know as democratic systems, but keep in mind that it survived for a very, very long time in Europe. And during that time, the noble caste was always the barbarian caste. Those who could fight for the land, protect the land, and conquer the land were the people who ruled. But it did not last forever. Eventually, these castes that dominated via strength created royalties, and these royalties continued their reign. But century after century, the nature of their authority slowly started to shift, leading to the demise of aristocracy. Because if strength was the cardinal virtue that allowed them to start ruling, eventually, via nepotism and via the simple passing down of power from father to son, strength was not necessary anymore because the authority was established by the rule of blood. And eventually, this gave way to opportunities for people to overthrow these systems. And a good example is France, right? I think we are famous for our revolution because we killed the king and we destroyed the aristocracy for the simple reason that the pre-revolution nobles had nothing to do with their glorious ancestors. According to Nietzsche, they had abdicated step by step their lordly prerogatives and lowered themselves to a function of royalty. So in short, they no longer possessed the strength or even the willingness to rule, but they still rejoiced and benefited from all of the privileges that come from being the ruling class. And naturally, it couldn't last forever, right? Because people realized that that weakness was just an open window for them to kick these people out of power. And we could discuss that for a long time. It is interesting to see that this aristocratic class did not see it coming. Just like our current aristocratic class doesn't seem to see it coming, if you look at the amount of hatred for the ruling class nowadays, I think that we're heading towards a revolution that is going to catch a lot of people by surprise when you see how conceited and how arrogant the people that rule over us are, when in fact the only power they have over us is the power that we allocate them. But that is a discussion for another time. Just saying that it's exactly what happened with the French Revolution. I understand that the French Revolution wasn't only good, but if we look at morality and the shift of morality that allowed it to happen, this is what Nietzsche believes took place and what I want to present to you today, because it also explains why morality shifted, right? A morality that benefited the strong and therefore was pushing strength as a virtue was eventually replaced by a system that killed aristocracy. And from that death of aristocracy was birthed a new morality. Because of course the new system wasn't going to espouse the morality of the previous owners of the kingdom, right? So they replaced it with the exact opposite, in which gradations of ranks and differences of worth among humans were rejected entirely, which is what we can call l'humanisme, l'égalitarisme, all of these things that we still live under today. We inherited these systems. We no longer live under a feudal system or a system that promotes strength as the one true virtue. under a democratic system, we're all the same, and as such, any sentiment that would serve to create distance between individuals is shunned because it goes against the principle of equality. And as I said previously, when I told you that aristocracy was also giving way and giving birth to things like slavery, I don't think that it is fair to say that equality is entirely bad. I made a full video about democracy and equality where I flesh out these thoughts in more depth and details, so if you're interested, check out the description. But it is true that these democratic societies gave birth to more peaceful and stable environments. As Nietzsche puts it, to refrain mutually from injury, from violence, from exploitation, and to put one's war on par with others, this may result in good conduct among individuals. And that is absolutely true. Societies are becoming safer and safer for that very reason. There is no need to dominate or exploit your fellow man anymore. Now you can live in peace and in equality. However, as soon as this principle I just described becomes the fundamental principle of society, it immediately discloses itself for what it really is, namely a will to the denial of life. Here, and this is Nietzsche talking, one must think profoundly and resist all sentimental weakness. Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak. And this is important that we establish before we go forward, because we're going to be discussing things that might offend you. This is normal. You are born in an age in which these things are not receivable. To believe, for example, that the goal of life is to conquer the strange and the weak, that is entirely opposed to what you were taught as a kid and what I was taught as a kid. But it is absolutely vital that we do that we push away our democratic sentiments and we observe these claims without getting offended, because it's the only way in reality to observe society and the flaws that plague the current system that we live in. And that's exactly what I attempt to do today. And this isn't going to be easy, because I know that many of you watching right now hold tolerance in high regard. You might pride yourself on being tolerant and regard anyone who is intolerant as a bad person. You might even got me pinned as some sort of crypto-fascist because I am trying to question this ideal. But understand that this unwillingness to question ideals is a problem in itself. And it's something that Nietzsche was already pointing out 150 years ago when he was saying that on no point is the ordinary European more unwilling to be corrected than on this matter. People now rave everywhere about coming conditions of society in which the exploding character is to be absent. That sounds to my ear as if they promised to invent a mode of life which should refrain from organic function. So understand here that Nietzsche is not telling you that slavery, exploitation, and all of these are good things. He's just saying that to regard them as pathologies and malfunction of society is silly because they are conditions of society. And if you have read any Marxist theory, you know that this is a direct critique of Marxism, because Marxism regards things like exploiting your fellow man as a glitch brought forth by capitalism. If man is to fix himself, we have to do away with that tendency. And this is something that Nietzsche disagrees with. But I want to make clear that while he disagrees with that, he's also not in support of economic liberalism or authoritarian capitalism. Nietzsche is only stating that will to power is the fundamental fact of all history, namely that humans will forever attempt to get ahead, and if that means exploiting others, then they will exploit others. Any theory that denies this fact or tries to present it as a consequence of capitalism instead of its cause is doomed to fail. This is not a video about Marxism, it was just important that I put that into words. And you'll notice that this proves true to this day, meaning that regardless of the regime, the ruling class managed to maintain its reign because it exploited the working class. This was true for when there was kings, and it's also true for when there is presidents. Regardless of how egalitarian or democratic our countries might be, they remain capitalist, meaning that the chief motor of our nations is still will to power, and with will to power comes subjecting others to labor, stealing people's labor, etc., etc. However, there is a difference in that the criteria of domination shifted from strength, so the strength of arm, the strength to dominate others with weapons, to the strength of wealth. So now, gradations of ranks and differences of worth among human beings still exist, they're still there, only that they're now measured by the number of zeros in our bank accounts. And as such, tolerance, this thing that should have accompanied a system of fairness, should be regarded with a certain level of suspicion, because if we're still living in that type of exploitative system, what good exactly is tolerance? What does it provide us, right? These are the simple questions I want to ask today, because we might very well find out that tolerance is just a smokescreen that is supposed to make us believe that we're all equal, when in reality we're still being ruled by an aristocratic class, one that traded excellence of virtue for money. And this has direct repercussions on the people being ruled, as you will see. And this is why criticizing tolerance is so vital for us, because it has ingrained itself as the chief value of our time, for the simple reason that it is both what birthed modern society, but also what keeps it alive. So good or bad, it must absolutely be criticized. And that is the strength, by the way, of Nietzschean philosophy. Nietzschean philosophy can be described in many ways, but I think that its strongest attribute is the ability to question everything, because it's a doctrine that stipulates that the philosopher of the future will have to go further in daring than the sensitive and pampered taste of a democratic century can approve of. He must always find himself in contradiction to the age in which he lives. His enemy must always be the ideal of his day. To that end, he will not deal with the truth in order that it may please him. Rather, he will have little faith in what we call truth. And this is something that puzzles some people who are new to Nietzschean philosophy, because truth in itself is often seen as a derivative of scientific methods, right? So people will tell you, for example, well, there is such a thing as truth. Like, for example, humans need oxygen to breathe. That is true. Yes, that is true. That is a scientific claim. This is not what Nietzschean philosophy is attempting to question. When we talk about truth in the Nietzschean sense, we discuss societal parameters, such as morality. And in that case, you'll notice that what we call truth is oftentimes just determinations of values that have become prevalent to the point that we stop questioning them and simply accept them as is. Example, look at tolerance. If I were to ask you watching right now, for example, why is tolerance good? How many of you would come up with a logical and factual response? Most people would only be able to say, tolerance is good because it is good, or because not being tolerant is bad. But these are not explanations, these are tautologies. There is nothing behind it, it's entirely empty morality. And we could question why us, as reasonable beings, would espouse and follow such emptiness. And there are many answers, the number one being that it's because it makes us feel good. Being tolerant is a factor that, in this modern age, is going to allow you to think of yourself as a good person, which will then make you more happy, in a sense, right? It's good to be good. We want to be good. We want to be able to regard ourselves as good, and we want society to see us as good. That is extremely important, because if we don't do that, we risk to just be rejected entirely, and we also risk to not be at peace with ourselves. And this is what Nietzsche called our good conscience. To be able to consider oneself as good, and to be able to have that good conscience, it's actually very simple. You don't have to do much. You simply have to align yourself with the morality of your time. So you observe what most people believe in, and you just do the same thing. You follow the trend and you follow the movement. I think you would agree that there is not much morality in this. It's a simple herd mentality that pushes most people to stay within the group and to not question at all what the group believes. It might very well be that the group is not actually believing in anything that would serve its benefit, but it doesn't actually matter. What matters is that everyone aligns. And on top of that, it requires no effort whatsoever. You'll notice that to stand against the morality and the ideals of your age comes with a great deal of risk. You can be rejected, you can lose your job, you can get in trouble, all sorts of trouble. So of course, people are not going to want to do that. It's much more comfortable to be part of the group. So in short, to be tolerant is to be passive, because it doesn't require any effort on your part, be it a moral effort or a physical effort. And I have a good example for that. Let's look at racism. Racism is widely regarded in our modern Western society as a bad thing. So this means that being anti-racist is not actually effortful at all. It doesn't require any real moral fortitude on your part, because you're just following what most people believed. So it is best defined as the action of not being racist. And you'd agree with me again that the action of not being racist is not an action, it's actually the opposite. So it's a passive opposition. An opposition, again, that cannot be described as brave, because there's no risk in being anti-racist. You're just espousing a belief that opposes an attitude, racism, that is widely regarded as bad. And that is very easy. And I say that not in defense of racism or to tell you that racism is good, but to tell you that if you're anti-racist, you should not think of yourself as a good person. I despise racism, but I've never pat myself on the back for it, because it's a given. And on top of that, society is with me on this one. It's an advice I give you guys. Whenever society as a whole agrees with one idea and you find yourself in that group, you should question it. Even just to make sure that you're not following blind ideas. Just to make sure that you're not just another idiot in the crowd. Sometimes society comes together as one to fight a principle or concept that is bad. And in this case, okay, you've done the work of questioning, but always do that effort, because now your passivity becomes an action. Now you can be proud. Now you can call yourself a good person. Although I would say that calling yourself a good person is a waste of time, because again, you're just buying yourself a good conscience. And this is where we enter the opposition between a good conscience and a good person, because the two are not the same. Many people have a good conscience, but they're not good people. And sometimes good people don't have good conscience. The one defining trait of a good person being that they are active, they're actively good, they're actively moral. This is what Nietzsche called morality as attitude, the embodiment of a value or virtue through our actions. So here's an example to make you understand the difference between a good conscience and morality as attitude. To be opposed to homelessness is buying yourself a good conscience, because it takes no effort whatsoever to say, oh, poor them, they must be called. Okay, great. Pat yourself on the back for feeling bad for people. That will surely get us somewhere. This really serves nothing except for your own ability to bolster your good conscience and to sleep at night. To be charitable, however, meaning to give something to a person who's homeless, expecting nothing in return, not even a thank, that is morality as attitude. And that is where true virtue comes from, because it takes self-sacrifice and it takes action. It takes true selflessness. And we'll get back to the concept of selflessness later, because it's very important and interesting. But the reason why I want to present this comparison to you is because this attempt at buying yourself a good conscience only serves to make people feel better about themselves, and the other, morality as attitude, improves the world as a whole. And I believe that this is exactly what happened with tolerance. Tolerance nowadays is never morality as attitude, because you don't have to do anything to be tolerant, you just have to be passive. So it's something that people do strictly to buy themselves a good conscience. The issue is that you'll notice that this very tolerance propagates itself via shame. Because if you refuse to be tolerant, you will be told, how dare you not be? Just like someone could tell you how bad they feel about homeless people, and then when you tell them, well, I don't feel the same way, they'll tell you, oh, how dare you not feel bad for them? You see this level of moral blackmail that exists at every single level of society? That benefits absolutely no one, because it doesn't make people into good individuals. And then you have the other way. And to explain to you why the other way, morality as attitude, is vastly superior, I have a little story to tell you. So it's a personal story. It's one that concerns my grandma. So my grandma was a very pious woman, and she was spending a lot of time with me, and she wanted to make sure I grew up into a good person, into a good man. But she also understood that it was completely useless to sit me down and lecture me for hours, because you do not teach virtue via words. You teach virtue via example. So what this intelligent woman did was, when I was a wee kid, when I was 5 or 6, she would take me outside, she would take me to do grocery shopping, and at the end of our trip, she would give me the rest of the money she didn't spend. And she would tell me, okay, listen, this is the money for you, right? You can spend it on whatever you want. If you so desire, you can wait until we get back home and you can buy yourself some books, you can buy yourself some candy, that's perfectly fine. Or you can give that money to the homeless people that live near where we live, these people who have nothing. I will not judge you regardless of what you do. It is your money. So she gave me that money and she told me, hey, you do with it what you want. And this woman allowed me to make a choice, a moral choice. As a young kid, I had to decide, do I want to be selfish or do I want to be charitable? And believe it or not, even as a kid, most oftentimes I was charitable. Sometimes I would keep the money, but most often I would tell myself, well, I can have candy and books whenever I want because I'm spoiled, but these people don't have much. So logically, it makes more sense for me to give them that money. And so I did, times and times again. And you know what this created in the future, 20 years later? It created a man that has a moral attitude, because to this day, if I have an excess of money and I see someone who needs it more than I do, I will gladly give that person money or buy them food. Does this make me a good person? Some would argue yes. I argue it just makes me someone who is able to be selfish sometimes and to be selfless other times. And this is vastly superior to people who just pat themselves on the back for having a good conscience and having good feelings, when these feelings and sentiments never result in anything tangible in real life. So, as a conclusion to this story, good conscience is a pathology that spreads via shame and social blackmail, and morality as attitude is a social virtue that spreads through example and effort. And unsurprisingly, you'll notice that the vast majority of people nowadays have good conscience, but they don't have moral attitudes, because to have a moral attitude is to self-sacrifice and also is to put in effort. And since the majority of people want to feel like good people without actually being good people, they will always embrace ways to achieve that without having to do anything. Example, tolerance. Once again, I repeat myself, but if you are a tolerant person, please tell me, what do you sacrifice? What do you do on a day-to-day basis that makes you tolerant? The answer is nothing. You're just being passive. And so you cannot claim that this is a virtue or that this makes you a good person. But you'll notice that the type of individual who puts the greatest emphasis on how tolerant and good they are also tend to be the worst type of people. And this is because all these efforts that they put in to buy themselves a good conscience are caused by a lack of virtue, because a good person does not need to tell you they're good, right? I just went out of my way to reveal to you that I am charitable. But if I had never told you, you wouldn't know. Why? Because there is no point in sharing that type of information, if not to feel better about oneself. Look at the amount of influencers who film themselves giving money to homeless people. You think that when the camera is not running, they give? Of course not. Why? It's just to look good in the eyes of others. It's for social credit. If everyone worked like this, society would go to shit. If we were only good to one another, if there was something in it for us, then no one would be good and we would all be selfish little gremlins. Well, I'll prove to you that things like tolerance are pushing society in that direction, because more and more people are encouraged to buy themselves a good conscience instead of actually being good people. And Nietzsche had an interesting thing to say about that. He said to be careful in dealing with those who attach great importance to being credited with moral tact. The practice of judging and condemning morally is the favorite revenge of the intellectually shallow on those who are less so. It is also a kind of revenge for their badly handled nature. And finally, it is an opportunity for acquiring spirit and becoming subtle. So in one way or a thousand, morality and a good conscience is a false intelligence. It's a mask that people purchase via ridiculous clown actions so that they can say, hey, look, I'm good. And then everyone has that mask and everyone thinks we're good people. And then you'll have that one person that refuses to wear the mask, but might deep down be a good person and do good things. And that person will be shunned by the clowns because he refuses to put on the appearance of goodness when deep down they might actually be the only good person in that entire crowd. And so we see that tolerance becomes a way for those devoid of virtues to present themselves as equal, if not superior, to those with a moral attitude without having to put in any effort. And that is naturally entirely opposed to the aristocratic spirit, because under a system that follows the aristocratic classification and gradation of ranks and values, one could only elevate themselves socially by becoming better and becoming more excellent. So if we look at the example I just gave you, someone who is extremely generous with their wealth and who is highly charitable, that would be seen as quite excellent and a very, very desirable virtue under the type of system. But this is not what we see under what I call the tyranny of tolerance, where, as I described, the mediocre gets to place themselves above the excellent without having to do anything to prove that they deserve this rank. And this process is mostly covered up by the fact that tolerance is often presented as a disinterested act. There's already a great hypocrisy considering that tolerance affords you a ton of social credit nowadays, meaning that anyone who will paint themselves as tolerant and present themselves as such must be regarded with suspicion because, naturally, since it is highly beneficial to be tolerant, we can only surmise that many people will pretend to be that in order, again, to acquire that social credit. But let's accept that this is right? For the sake of the argument, let's pretend that tolerance, as a virtue, is entirely disinterested. This then begs the following question. If it is, and you don't gain anything from it, and it benefits the people that you're tolerant towards, right? This is the big idea of tolerance. You're not tolerant for yourself. You're tolerant because it allows people who are excluded by society or marginalized to be integrated because they won't be rejected anymore. Okay, if that is true, what personal price, what sacrifice do you pay to be tolerant? Charity, for example, is the sacrifice of personal wealth. What sacrifice is attached to the value of tolerance? What do tolerant people have to pay? Well, according to Nietzsche, because of course he has an answer to that, in a person created for command, self-denial and modest retirement, instead of being virtues, would be the waste of virtues. So Nietzsche tells us, okay, in someone who is highly successful and strong, their tolerance would be just wasting their virtue away. That is already interesting in itself, but it also gives us the answer to my query. Because if you're not one such person, and you're tolerant, this essentially means that you are sacrificing nothing. If you're devoid of the virtues of commandment, sacrificing them to achieve a good conscience essentially costs nothing because you had nothing to sacrifice from the start. Do you understand what I'm trying to get at here? If you're the type of person who is in a position of power, who is in a position where they could actually use their ability to command to downgrade people, to oppress people, then the act of tolerance could be seen as a sacrifice. You sacrifice your ability to exploit others for the sake of these people, and you don't gain anything, you lose something. But if you could never command these people to start with, you didn't actually sacrifice anything. So, feeling good for doing nothing once again is not a virtue and cannot be described as a virtue. It is simply a way to buy yourself a good conscience. And this is why, and this is a quote again, every system of unegoistic morality, which takes itself universally and appeals to everyone, not only sins against good taste, but also constitutes a form of injury against the higher, rarer, and more privileged type of man. So what Nietzsche is trying to tell us here is that tolerance, as a quote-unquote virtue, works on two fronts. Either you are going to downgrade someone who had excellent ability to command because now you no longer allow that man to judge what is good or what is bad for himself. You're forcing him to just follow the crowd. And then for the rest of the crowd who never had that ability to start with, nothing is sacrificed. You just comfort these people in their mediocrity, and worse than that, you reward them for it. You reward them for following their mediocre predisposition. So tolerance not only is not a virtue, but it's actually a flaw, because it becomes a machine that just mass produces mediocrity. It turns people who could have been excellent into people who are mediocre, and it leaves people who are mediocre as just mediocre. Nothing actually happens. And this is best explained, I believe, by the fact that, again, we have this hyper-focus on selflessness nowadays, where you're only a good person if what you do is entirely disinterested. But understand that most cardinal virtues, most traditional virtues, benefited both sides. Because someone who was charitable was, in a sense, elevating their soul. To give was to become a better person, but you also helped the person that you gave money to or that you gave food to. Now we have a system instead that insists so much on us never actually getting anything back from our virtues that it can no longer promote virtues. So it promotes empty things that sure cost nothing, but also result in nothing. It doesn't result in any net good for society. It just results in a bunch of people who are masks. And I think that nowhere is this more visible than in Europe. Europe right now has many religions. There's Islam and there's Christianity and there's Judaism. But I think that these religions pale in the face of the number one cult that is espoused by pretty much everyone, and that is the religion of sympathy. A system that promotes everything that makes you a kind, more tolerant person as good, and everything else must be rejected as bad. Which I don't need to explain to you at this point that this is a clown system, because it's a system based on good conscience that is not actually requiring anyone to do anything to be better. You just have to blindly follow the group. But you'll notice that even though there is nothing to be proud of about this system of morality, it doesn't stop us, Europeans, to feel morally superior to other nations because they refuse to do it. So recently we saw the Uganda debacle. So Uganda passed a bunch of laws to outlaw homosexuality, as silly as it sounds. And it was mesmerizing to see the wave of angry cries coming from Europeans and from North Americans. It's as if their own parents were being torched to shreds or burnt at the stake. Why? Because, well, it goes entirely against our religion of sympathy, right? How dare these people not align with the way we work? Our morality is surely superior. Our morality is better. By not doing what we do, they are evil unequivocally, even though they might have very good reasons to do that. Again, I'm not defending whatever they do, because it's not my place. It's not my place as a European to enact that type of moral judgment on people who just so happen to not align with me. But I think the reason why Europeans, and in reality white people, are so obsessed with sympathy is because we're trying to make up for our bad conscience. We're trying to make up for our past. Since we conquered so much and we hurt so much, we killed so much, we pillaged so much, just like any other culture, by the way, with any shred of power, we now feel the need, unlike these other cultures, to pay back the people that we hurt. So we do that by becoming universally good, right? We want to be universally sympathetic towards every person who suffers. And this makes us look like complete Tartuffe, if you know who Tartuffe is, because it doesn't look genuine. I can tell you for a fact that these other countries don't look at us and think, oh, look at these perfect angels of morality. They look at us like, oh, look at these fucking pricks. You did all of that in the past, and now you're going to turn around and give us lessons about how to be a good person. That is certainly not going to stand. But the only people who don't seem to have realized that yet are Europeans. And it also goes towards the idea of equality, right? I think that the reason why we pretend that we're now all equal, even though it stares at us in the face that this is not true, is because we have to atone for something. We have to atone for our past. And it would be somewhat funny, again, as a clown show and as a circus, if it didn't lead to the complete debasement of our spirits. Because you might have noticed that the European spirit is in the gutter nowadays. It's not doing so good. And Nietzsche actually warned against this universal sympathy, stating that whoever could listen past the noise and vanity would hear a hoarse, genuine, growing note of self-contempt, which belongs to the overshadowing and uglifying of Europe. The man of modern ideas, this conceited ape, is excessively dissatisfied with himself. He suffers, and in his vanity, he wants only to suffer with his fellows. And I think that this perfectly explains the overall lack of virtue that is now widespread in the West. Because the system that we live under, which is no longer an aristocratic system, it's a democratic system, will never encourage us to espouse moral attitudes. So we can never make up for bad conscience with actions because it's intolerable. So instead, we have to buy ourselves a good conscience. But we also know that this doesn't work. It just makes the problem worse and worse and worse. So instead of actually having a vigorous reaction and getting back on our feet, we're simply comforting ourselves in our own mediocrity, and we're just digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And I hope that even if you're the type of person who regards tolerance as a good thing, you will have understood, based on my expose, that this can no longer continue. This is no solution. It's not good for us, and it's not even good for the world around us. So, now that I shat copiously on the modern idea of tolerance, let's discuss what true tolerance, based on virtue, could constitute. Because it is absolutely possible to be moral and to be virtuous. I think something that you have understood from the story about my grandma. I'm personally not opposed to virtue. I'm trying to promote virtue with this video, but I want to promote real virtue. And the same was true for Nietzsche. There's this weird misunderstanding, I guess, of people who think that Nietzsche was the type of person who just rejected virtue altogether, or who even believed that there was no such thing as a good personality trait to have or a bad thing, owing to the fact that he called himself an immoralist, I think, so people just take it at face value. But understand that the title of immoralist only means one that questions morality, not one that rejects morality as a concept, as a societal concept. Nietzsche perfectly accepts that, proof being that most of his books are about morality. He's trying to promote a new, more vigorous, healthier morality for Europeans, and it was true back then, and it's also true today. So it's important to not believe that he was just some relativist. No, he absolutely believed in virtue as well. It's simply that he wanted us to question these values, these virtues, these morals. He wanted us in reality to question everything, regardless of what society had to say about it. So essentially, to exist above morality, like an eagle, instead of existing below morality, like a sheep. To decide for ourselves whether or not something is judicious to follow, if something is good or something is bad. In short, to create our own values. And to put it in his terms, these values might be regarded as good or bad by society, but it doesn't matter. What matters is the kindly patronage and defense of whatever is misunderstood, be it God or devil. Quote, "Let us go with all our devils to the help of our God. It is probable that people will misunderstand us. What does it matter? And even if they were right, have not all gods been rebaptized devils? But let us be careful. Every virtue inclines to stupidity. Stupid to the point of sanctity, they say in Russia. Out of pure honesty, we could eventually become bores, or worse, saints. Virtue has been more injured by the tediousness of its advocates than by the strength of its detractors." And I think that nothing could be more true. If there is one force that is pushing people away from tolerance nowadays, it's tolerant people. It is insane how effective these types are at making me want to be intolerant, because I listen to them and I'm like, okay, you're not a good person, I can tell. And the fact that you preach about this tolerance so much makes me think that this is a symptom of your pathology. So I don't want to follow that either. But, as we are trying to attempt right now to promote tolerance as a possible virtue, we're going to try and see if it is possible, I believe that we should follow Nietzsche's advice and not become the type of person that pontificate about morality, about this is good and this is bad, because at the end of the day, this doesn't lead us anywhere. You'll notice that both the religious type and the zealots that claim to be atheists follow the same exact principle, and therefore they are both extremely ineffective in convincing anyone beyond the weak-minded or the people who are very easy to scare by telling them that they will be sent to some sort of hell or social hell because they refuse to follow a virtue that they themselves don't feel in their heart, which results in people, again, who are not good people at all. If you have to be scared out of your wits to do something because it's good, then this is not actually good and you're not a good person for following it. And as such, any attempt at promoting tolerance as a worthy virtue to develop must be done outside of the boundaries of sympathy or commiseration, which is a tall task, because trying to convince people to be virtuous without relying on these crutches is difficult, but that is when you're actually doing your job properly. So, this is when we finally get into the topic of master and slave morality. We've been talking about Nietzsche for a long time now, and these topics never really came up. I never really explained them properly because I was waiting for the right time. And in a video about tolerance, it is the perfect time because you will notice that the modern idea of tolerance relies entirely on slave morality to function, and one virtue that would come as close as possible to tolerance that we could propose today would be one promoted by master morality. So, what is the difference? Well, in the case of master morality, it's simple. It is when the ruler is the one who determines the conception of good. And in this case, it is always going to be the exalted and proud disposition which is regarded as good, which is regarded as the distinguished feature. So essentially, strength is good in a society ruled by master morality. And in this kind of morality, very interestingly also, we'll notice that the antithesis good and bad doesn't really exist, meaning that it is replaced by the antithesis noble and despicable, which are not the same. It is not the same to be noble and to be good. To be good, again, you just have to be full of good sentiments. To be noble, you have to do noble actions and good actions. That is the difference. And in these systems, naturally also, the cowardly, insignificant, and those thinking merely of their own selfishness are despised. Why? Because they stand against the principles that are seen as good. If being brave, if being charitable is seen as noble, then what is despicable is going to be the exact opposite. And so you also understand from that unlike what some people might think, under master morality, tolerance can exist. It can be in the sphere of things that are considered virtue, if and only if it isn't tolerance for these despicable traits, which in itself is a form of mercy towards those that might be tempted to embrace them. It is the exact difference of what is happening nowadays with our system, where we comfort mediocre people into being mediocre by feeding them empty morality that they can follow without effort, and turning excellent people into shells of themselves because they are forced to repress the way they feel so they cannot commend anymore. Here we have a system that is going to, in a sense, force, so it's authoritarian, the mediocre to stop being mediocre because they will no longer be allowed to follow traits that are seen as despicable unless they want to be despicable themselves, and the noble souls are free to pursue noble virtues that will always come with great efforts on their part, great discipline, and a high sense of responsibility. Which you'll notice also indirectly protects society from decadence, because if you shun despicable traits and you shun people who espouse these traits, you create an environment where these traits are very unlikely to develop because no one will want to be rejected by society or seen as despicable. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it's the exact same under slave morality. The only difference being that under master morality, there is no pretense such as good person or bad person. You are simply noble or despicable. And so the entire component of social blackmail is not present simply because it wouldn't work. It's something that I've noticed personally. Strong people, people of character, people of virtue, don't care much if groups or societies or morality deems them evil or deems them bad because they have the inherent knowledge and belief in their own quality and in their own virtue. And this is because people who follow master morality and systems of master morality rely entirely on the inner strength of the individual. Nietzsche said that the noble type of man regards himself as a determiner of values. He does not require to be approved, he passes the judgment. Under slave morality, however, it is the opposite. Individuals are constantly in need of affirmation. They cannot by themselves decide that they're worthy or that they're good people. So they need the group to tell them that. And it goes so far as some of them not even being able to live unless the group tells them that their existence is valid. Something you see more and more nowadays, where people say, oh, we have to normalize this behavior, or validate this behavior, validate my existence. Who would say such a thing but a weakling? A strong man will never ask you to validate shit. He doesn't need you to validate his existence. It's enough that he believes that what he does is correct. He does not need to see in the eyes of others any level of respect or any level of acceptance. Because who are you to tell me if I'm valid or not? The only person that can determine my validity is myself. But if you take one look at modern society, you'll see that this is not the majority of people. The majority of people, especially these groups that are constantly clamoring to be accepted by society, are made up of individuals who are constantly trying to get society to recognize their legitimacy as people and even as humans. They usually go as far as to ask society to change for them, which is ultimately the apex of slave morality. If master morality is to use your own inner strength to change values and to create your own values, then the act of begging society and begging people to please change the values to make your life slightly better can only be described at its exact opposite. And this is why tolerance has become the biggest virtue of our age. It's because since there are more and more people like this, and these people need tolerance to exist, they need you to not question their existence at all and to just accept it as is and not just accept it, but validate it. They will, of course, also insist that everyone be tolerant because it is the one condition for their existence. But because these types lack strength altogether, they are forced to rely on things such as moral blackmail, for example, by using tolerance as a weapon and pointing out the people who refuse to play in their game by calling them out for being quote-unquote bad. Which is why, by the way, the silent majority is more and more starting to see these people for what they are, which are manipulators and bad people, which of course they will never accept because they have, again, to fight for that good conscience, but deep down, this is truly what they are. And this is made immediately apparent when you look below the surface of good and evil. Because in reality, when these types tell you that tolerance is good and that intolerance is bad or evil, what they really mean is that tolerance is good for them and that intolerance is bad for them. So at the core of this entire thing is selfishness first and foremost, which ultimately means that their system of morality is entirely egoistical. It was never for the greater good, it was for their good. And we could say the same for master morality, right? I'm not claiming here that a system that would exist under master morality would be one that exists for the benefits of everyone. We've seen at the start that this is not true. Some people would, of course, suffer under that system. But at least it wouldn't pretend to be disinterested. It wouldn't pretend, like slave morality attempts to be for everyone, because we know that this is simply not true. So if I had to pick, I would pick the morality that isn't afraid of acting in the sun, that isn't afraid of actually revealing its true intent. Because if master morality is a form of self-glorification, oftentimes at the detriment of others, slave morality is self-depreciation. So not only do you lower yourself under that system, but you're also taking down the entirety of society with you. And we see that in our modern paradigm, right? If master morality results in a society that shuns weakness and therefore breeds strong individuals, the other one, slave morality, shuns strength and therefore creates weaklings. And that is logical and part for the course. Quote, Supposing that the abused, the oppressed, the suffering, the unemancipated, the weary, and those uncertain of themselves should moralize, what would be the common element in their moral estimates? Probably a pessimistic suspicion with regard to the entire situation of man, perhaps even a condemnation of man. The slave has an unfavorable eye for the virtues of the powerful. On the other hand, these qualities which serve to alleviate the existence of sufferers are flooded with light. It is here that a friendly hand and a warm heart attains to honor. So to contextualize, it would be the equivalent of letting homeless people decide what policies should be enacted in regards to homelessness. What do you think they're going to come up with? They're of course going to create policy that is going to allow them to have a house. And I'm not throwing a rock at these people or saying that this is bad. It's logical and it's natural. The question is, should we, society, allow that to happen? Because it might very well be the case that the policies enacted by these people, but that the morality that they would create would not actually result in them not being homeless anymore. It might result in more misery, because there is a strong chance that the morality and the set of virtues that they've been following is part of the reason why they've ended up in that situation in the first place. To make it even simpler, there is a reason why when we make soccer teams at school, the kid that is being picked to be a captain and to select the other kids is the athletic jock and not the fat kid. The fat kid ends up the goalie. But there is something even more interesting, because here again, you could fire back by telling me that I'm an asshole and I'm selfish, blah, blah, blah. It's not untrue. Yes, of course, I am all of these things. But understand that the people who create slave morality are also that, because slave morality, just like master morality, is a morality centered around selfishness, as I've demonstrated. People only follow things and tenets that benefits them immediately in the short term. As a society, we should ask instead what benefits the greater amount of people for the long term, and the answer to that will never be slave morality. The reason why we are struggling so much in the West nowadays is because our systems center around slave morality. And this again does not mean that charity cannot exist under master morality, but that if it does exist, it can only come from strength. Because according to Nietzsche, actual charity is not born out of pity, but rather from an impulse generated by the superabundance of power. So in the aristocratic sense, generosity rhymes with strength. You have plenty and so you give. You are a good person. But you might have noticed that it's not true in our world. In our world, for some reason, generosity oftentimes rhymes with stupidity, right? To give too much is to be trop bonhomme, it's to be too naive, it's to be too kind-hearted. Interesting how an entire system that is supposed to schedule itself around turning everyone into a good person has also come to depreciate values, again, such as charity, which it should uphold. But that is not surprising at all. Again, I quote, "A shade of depreciation has attached itself to the good man, to the point that good and stupid are now synonymous under slave morality." And sadly, the same is true for tolerance. The people that push back against tolerance rightfully also point out the fact that to be tolerant is oftentimes to be an idiot. To refuse to discriminate is to be a weakling and an idiot, because it might also just mean that you never actually took the time to think about certain things and to realize that you would be better off pushing some concepts away and accepting others. To accept everything as one, as equal, and as just valid across the board is the work of someone who has actually never put in any thought. And that is highly concerning, because nowadays people are not tolerant out of genuine belief or concern for the well-being of others. They are tolerant either out of stupidity, cowardice, or fear. All things that, as I explained to you, remove any semblance of virtue from tolerance. Now it is actually just a policy. It's a social policy you have to follow or else. And I'm sorry, but I don't like that. And this is caused by slave morality, because slave morality does that to pretty much every virtue. Because now we're left with a bunch of people who will only pursue virtues that will make them look like good people in the eyes of others. And since these virtues, for the most part, just align with having good sentiments, being a good person and being kind, which again, anyone can do, it doesn't take any effort at all, then we all end up kind. And if everyone is kind, then it doesn't really mean anything anymore, so no one is. And I think you might have realized that or noticed. We live in the most moral age, the most progressive age, the most open, warm-hearted age, and yet people have never been shittier to one another. Why? Because actual virtue has died and we're all stuffing our faces with good sentiments. And it's the paradox of our age. Nietzsche was calling our age the ultra-moral age, an age that is obsessed with morality, and this is exactly what we have, but not the right type. We're not obsessed with morality that would uphold people, turn people into better humans, which would, for one, create people who don't need to rely on others to feel good about themselves. No, instead, we have a bunch of good sentiments, we're all full of our good conscience, and yet we depend entirely on the opinion of others to be able to exist, or even to decide whether or not we are good people. And that is the tragedy of slave morality, because it creates beings who seek to arouse a good opinion of themselves, which they themselves do not possess, and consequently also do not deserve, and who yet believe in this good opinion afterwards. And maybe this rings a bell. Maybe you have met people like this. People that are full of beautiful ideals and who are not afraid to share it with other people verbally, but who upon further examination seem to uphold none of these values, meaning that they never actually apply them in their life, and worse, they don't even seem to really believe in any of them. They don't seem to actually deep down think that these things are good. They're just mindlessly repeating them because they've been told that this is how you are a good person. They are in a sense like a dog doing a trick in order to receive a treat while remaining incapable of understanding the meaning behind the treat. The dog is too dumb for that. He just knows that if I do this, I get food, so I'll just do this. And this is because, according to our good friend Friedrich, the ordinary man is only that which he passes for. Not being at all accustomed to fixed values, he did not assign to himself any other than that which his master assigned to him. And this is a hard pill to swallow, but one that at this point I am forced to accept. I think that most people uphold the value, virtue, and morality of their age, nothing more and nothing less. They're too weak or too cowardly to say this is good and this is bad, so instead they just wait patiently to see what the crowd has to say first, and then once they hear it, they just align with the crowd. And since we just so happen to exist under the reign of democracy and equality, that thing that everyone believes in just so happens to be tolerance. And this is why I fully believe that the ones that are the most vocal and the most hysterical about tolerance nowadays would have been the most racist and vile individuals in the past. Because again, they simply align with what is seen as good, what is seen as correct, and what is seen as right. And this is an incredibly sad state of existence to be in, because you've essentially turned yourself into a parrot. But on top of that, it makes you incredibly vulnerable to personal attacks, because since you cannot decide what is good or bad outside of yourself, you also cannot have an opinion of yourself as a good or bad person. And so, as Nietzsche says, you are forever waiting for an opinion about yourself, and then instinctively submit yourself to it, even a bad and unjust one. So if you were wondering why so many people seem to be terrorized of being called bad or evil, this is why. It's because some individuals cannot form an opinion of themselves if they do not rely on the opinion of others, which of course makes them very easy to manipulate, because if you put enough of these people in a room, or worse, a country, and you just have a megaphone blaring tolerance is good, they're going to police each other into all being tolerant, because they're all going to be terrorized of one another. Right? As Sartre used to say, l'enfer c'est les autres. Other people become a mirror that force you to actually conform entirely to the morality of your age, or else you will not even be able to consider yourself as good, which results in society as we know it. And I now have a quite long quote from Nietzsche that I don't even need to comment. It's as if he was a time traveler and he could see what we would become eventually. Listen to this and tell me if it's not the perfect description of our times. In an aristocratic commonwealth, the dominant qualities are that to which it owes the fact that it still exists. These qualities are called virtue, and they alone are developed to maturity. One such quality is severity. Every aristocratic society is intolerant in the education of youth, in the relations of people, young and old, and in the penal laws. It counts intolerance itself among the virtues, under the name of justice. Finally, however, a happy state of things results. There are perhaps no more enemies, and the means of life are present in superabundance. With one stroke, the bond and constraint of the old discipline severs. It is no longer regarded as necessary. There manifests an extraordinary decay and self-destruction, owing to the savagely opposing and seemingly exploding egoisms, which strive with one another for sun and light, and can no longer assign any limit, restraint, or forbearance for themselves by any means of the hitherto existing morality. So in a sense, what Nietzsche just described is the cycle of civilizations. Hard times create strong men create easy times create weak men, and right now we are caught dead in the middle of the weak men create hard time cycle, so you better buckle up because it's going to be our responsibility to fix this shit at some point. But interestingly enough, that cycle is also the cycle of slave and master morality, because whenever it is needed to fight against hard times and strong men are needed, you can only breed strong men with master morality. With slave morality, you can only breed slaves, aka weaklings. And so it is so important to point at the inadequacies of that morality and what it produces, with tolerance, for example, because this ideology, again, this morality, likes to present itself as good, but upon further examination, we realize that it is so obsessed with the action of breaking its chains that it forgets that freedom itself is a trap and that true liberty can only be found in the resolute acceptation of one's discipline and responsibility. And to continue with that quote, it is then that the dangerous and disquieting point will be reached. Nothing but new whys, nothing but new hoes, no common formulas any longer, which you will recognize as a paradox of tolerance because the very concept is supposed to help us accept and embrace a wide range of perspectives, but instead it constrains us all within one perspective and one opinion, because anything else that deviates from that one opinion is seen as bad or evil. Quote continued, "What will the moral philosophers who appear at this time have to preach? They discover that everything around them decays and produces decay, that nothing will endure until the day after tomorrow, except one species of man, the incurably mediocre. The mediocre alone have a prospect of continuing and propagating themselves. They will be the men of the future, the sole survivors. Be like them, be mediocre, is now the only morality which still obtains a hearing. But it is hard to preach this morality. It can never avow what it is and what it desires. It has to talk of moderation and dignity and brotherly love. Exactly what I explained previously when I told you that these people who push slave morality come under the cover of kindness. They'll tell you, hey, if you want to be a nice person, better do this. They'll never tell you straight up that they're doing that out of selfishness because they want to benefit. But what you don't know is that if you're the type of person that was destined for command, destined for excellence, this could be the reason why you become mediocre. And it's something that Nietzsche explains as well. The fact that people of high virtue and value are not immune to that. If anything, they are prone to fall for it because since the heart is so open, since the heart is so big, since they have such an overwhelming abundance of strength and will, they are very eager to spend it to help others, and they can then be manipulated into giving up that will entirely. But let me tell you this, what type of society do you think would be the best, the most charitable? It's one where most people have an abundance of strength, an abundance of resources to spend. If we allow slave morality to create a society that is devoid of that, where everyone is here, then who is going to be there to give? There will be no one to give. And so the very system that aims to create a society and environment that would be best suited for people who are downtrodden, oppressed, and in need actually is going to give birth to an environment that will not be able to provide these people with help anymore because everyone will be in need. And this is why, as cruel as it might sound, an aristocratic system based on master morality managed to balance the two. Yes, some people suffered, but at least there were some people who did not suffer, who could spare their sufferings, if only for a bit. And they certainly caused a lot of suffering as well. But look at the world today. These people are gone. We were told that if we got rid of the elite and of these people, the world would be just a peaceful place. But it's not true. Sufferings have never been higher, and we're still being ruled by an elite with no virtue whatsoever, who is not even helping us anymore. An elite that manipulates us and blackmails us using concepts such as tolerance. So, as a conclusion, far from being a virtue that elevates civilizations, it actually crushes them under the weight of shame and petty selfishness, relying entirely on the mediocrity of men and women, too weak to stand up for what they believe in, the so-called good people. And that is going to be that for this video. If I were to give you an answer or solution, I think you already know what I'm going to tell you, which is that we have to espouse master morality once more. As painful as it sounds, it is the solution, because then we could start to actually observe and question values and morality for what they are, and we would be able to come up with our own systems of values, which would then be best aligned with a society where people pursue virtue for the right reason. But if we were to go even further, I believe that to become virtuous, we must accept the part of darkness within master morality. Accept that suffering is inevitable, and that to, in a sense, reduce suffering as much as possible, it must first and foremost be accepted. And that is true at the societal level. It's also true at the individual level. There is a quote by Nietzsche that I'm going to end the video on that I think is excellent in that regard, where he tells us that we should tell ourselves daily that there is something cruel in the tendencies of my spirit. And that level of introspection and that level of honesty and self-awareness would then allow us to strive for more virtuous acts. So in a sense, once we accept that shadow that is part of us, then and only then can we truly become good. And it is on these wise words that the educated barbarian cycle on Nietzsche ends. It has been a long, long journey, almost 2 years with many videos, but I'm glad we took our time because, as you might have noticed, Nietzschean philosophy is rich and there is so much to discuss, to be honest. I really, really urge you to read the book, please. What I say is maybe 45% to 50% of what is in that one book. Reading Beyond Good and Evil will change your life, and it will make you a better person. I guarantee you that. So now that we're done with our good friend Friedrich, we are going to move on to Jung. The next installment of The Educated Barbarian will be about psychology. Finally, I know that many of you guys have been waiting for that, so it's going to be very, very soon. We're of course not done with Nietzschean philosophy, because at this point I'm full on Nietzschean, so I'm still going to make some videos with some level of Nietzschean ideals in them. I have actually 7 or 8 planned, but that will be outside of The Educated Barbarian, right? We're going to now focus entirely on Jung and psychology, so you can look forward to that. If you have enjoyed this installment, you can support the channel on my Ko-fi page. It's the first link in the description. It is actually very important because it's now my secondary job, right? These videos take me a long time to write, to record, and to edit. So if you want to see more of them, make sure that you pledge, make sure that you donate. Whatever is appreciated regardless of the amount, because it shows me that there is interest in my work and it pushes me forward. Thank you for watching. Have a good day.